Welcome to this episode of the NewSpace India podcast, a show to keep you informed and engaged on India's space activities. France and India started their space programs around the same time, interestingly, and leaders on the both sides found synergies almost immediately to work together. Today we have Mathieu Weiss, who is the Counsellor for Space for the French Space Agency, who is actually based in Bangalore for the last 6 years, talk to us on the various activities that the two countries have been engaging for the past 5 decades and plan for the future. So, Mathieu, welcome to this episode of the NewSpace India podcast.
Thank you, Narayan. I'm very happy to be here.
India and France have had a very long and detailed kind of relationship in outer space, which goes back to several decades now, and it's probably good to acknowledge that India and France are two of the closest partners in any space activities today. Tell us a bit about how this relationship started and probably also why.
Yes, this goes back more than half a century now, and actually I would even say that the relationship is one of the most important ones France and India have as a whole, not only in space. So the two countries started cooperating in space in 1964 with the launches of the Centaur and the Dragon sounding rockets out of the Tumba launch base in Kerala. So this is a story that goes very, very long back, and India and France since then never stopped cooperating. So we have had exchanges in the launch vehicle field with the development of an engine which we have jointly developed. It's a liquid propulsion engine that is used on Ariane on the European side and is used on all the Indian launch vehicle under the Vikas name. So it's exactly the same engine which is today produced in India by Godrej in Mumbai. And I think this was a tremendously strong partnership, the one on the liquid engine propulsion, because I think 40 families of Indian engineers established and settled in France, in the suburbs of Paris, and they were totally integrated in the French teams. So during mid-70s up to the 80s, we were used in France in the space sector to have a number of Indian specialists with us, and it definitely changed the whole idea, the whole philosophy, and we since then considered India to be kind of a brother in developing space. You have to know also that CNES and ISRO were founded almost in the same time. So we have the same kind of history. We are not the very big ones, so we are both were created as a medium-sized player. So we have a lot of similarities that made us work together. More recently, we worked on joint satellites, which it's also a very impressive cooperation, because when two nations join to build a satellite together, it's something that is not easy and holds a lot of challenges. So we have now developed and launched two climate observing satellites, one in 2011 and one in 2013, and we will launch a new joint mission next year on an OceanSat satellite, Indian OceanSat satellite, where we embark an Argos instrument, which is a French data collecting and positioning instrument, very, very effective system and program that we carry on an international basis. And we are working on much more things. So we have also in project a joint constellation of satellites for maritime domain awareness, and we can say today that this will be the first constellation built in cooperation between several nations. So it's a French-Indian constellation of satellites. So yes, history has played a big role in the tremendous kind of trust we are experiencing today.
Let's break this down into multiple parts so that we go down to each of these in a more detailed fashion. So let's go back to the earliest one that you mentioned, which is the Centaur rockets. So I believe that was probably the early 60s.
That actually started in '64 when the first Centaur rocket was launched from the Tumba test range. We launched approximately, I think it was 65 sounding rockets that were launched in total. Actually, what happened is that in the first days we shipped sounding rockets from France in wooden boxes, and they were built together in Kerala. But shortly after some of these launches, we build the rockets themselves in India. So there was already, this spirit of make in India maybe, but at least transferring the knowledge and looking at this Indian space community in its birth, which was very avid and which wanted to do things. So we immediately started to share a lot of things with them. At the time it was people like Mr. Abdul Kalam and Madhavan Nair and Vikram Sarabhai. All these people were part of these efforts. So they all became legends. But at the time it was a small team. And they work together in a very, very brotherhoodly manner. So these French rockets in Kerala, they have made history.
And I also believe the French also contributed some payloads to these initial rockets.
They did, and I can even tell you that for the very first Indian launch, the Apache rocket that started in 1963, the payload that was on board, which you all saw the pictures of Mr. Abdul Kalam filing the payload so that it fits into the fairing because it was too big. So that specific payload was developed in California in a lab by a young French engineer whose name was Jacques Blamont. And Jacques is still one of my colleagues, a very senior one since he's 92 right now, but he still comes to work every day. And Jacques has developed this sodium vapor measurement device which flew. So it was a French payload in a way, developed in the US by a Frenchman. And this payload flew on the very, very, very first Indian launch.
That's where I think the real first beginning was, when the first Nikkei Apache rocket already had a French payload. And from then on, started to build these rockets, and then eventually India started to adopt some of these sounding rocket technology and started to build some of them here. But from then on, so I guess that was the mid-60s. And what happened after the period from there? So was there a gap in this cooperation, or?
No, there wasn't a gap. At the time, it was the beginning of Sriharikota.
Yeah.
And actually, the partnership was such that our Indian friends wanted to see what we had done in French Guiana. So actually, there was a lot of exchanges on the infrastructures on the ground, how to build a launch base, which kind of premises, which kind of installations, how do you prepare the launch vehicle, so how would you, manage the whole sequence from the arrival of the rocket on the range to the launch pad. So we worked a lot on that, and there was a lot of exchanges by the people who designed the Kourou launch base, so the one we have in French Guiana. And even today, when I go to Sriharikota, I see a lot of similarities which are kind of funny, because we can see that we were brothers in doing this approximately at the same period.
So you talked about how a lot of the Indian researchers or Indian scientists were in France. And so what was the reason for them to go to France?
Well, I think liquid propulsion was a very interesting factor and incentive, because at the time our teams in France, and especially the teams of a company at the time called SEP in Vernon, were the best in the world in the field of liquid propulsion. And we intended to develop an engine for the Ariane rocket, which was coming up. And at the time, we already were looking for innovation and the best ideas. And at the time, we suggested to our Indian friends the idea to do this development together. And since there was an interest also in India to develop a liquid engine for the upcoming Indian rockets, that led to an agreement between ISRO and CNES with an exchange of personnel or a lot of ISRO engineers who actually came to work in France in a spirit of co-developing. So I would like to say, the engine was developed by an integrated team of French and Indian engineers.
In the meanwhile, I think there was also some cooperation also on the communication side with the satellites.
You mean you mean with Apple and the first the telecom satellites, the first Indian telecom satellites that were launched from our launch base in French Guiana? That was 1980. And that, of course, was a big step because we started being the launch partner for India for all the satellites that couldn't fly out of India because they were too big, too heavy, and telecom satellites are usually very big birds. So we started, it was 1981, the launch of Apple, and we never stopped that cooperation because we just launched a couple of months ago the 23rd Indian satellite out of France.
That again is a very significant relationship because India, I think, the first Ariane rocket, I think, failed, and then the second one is when the Apple was carried. Was it right?
I think Apple flew on the third one.
Okay.
You have to check this in detail.
So, but yeah, essentially, I think funnily the Indian satellite was named after the French rocket as the Apple passenger payload experiment and so on, and that's why the name Apple for an Indian satellite.
Indeed, and it is still there's still a mock-up of Apple to be seen in ISRO Museum on Old Airport Road in Bangalore, and it's always very moving to see that this was actually the beginning of a lot of friendship. And when you go to Kourou in French Guiana, you also have images of the Apple launch. So I think both countries really keep very, very emotional memories of this launch.
Yeah, from what I understand, I also probably know that India has never flown any of its satellites to the geostationary orbit on any other rocket other than the French rocket.
That's true, but that's why I call it a brotherhood. If you have a partner like that, you need to go to see other people, and I think it's the same in the other way around. We have launched satellites on PSLV, and we're absolutely happy and glad of what has been done here in India. So it is really something that is stronger than what we usually call a partnership or a cooperation in space. I think the fact that it lasts for so long puts it into a totally different category.
From a perspective of the approach to engineering itself or innovation itself, what do you think is the difference between French teams and Indian teams?
Well, I'm in India since more than 6 years now, and I think I have a pretty good understanding now of being a kind of a translator between my Indian friends and my French friends. I think what is still the most struggling part is the calendar. French people or French space teams need a lot of time from the concept to launch. While in India, this time is very much reduced, so things go very fast. And I have, looking after putting projects together or looking after synergies, I have a hard time in connecting the French projects with the Indian projects because their timings are very much different. Giving you an example like a Mars mission. A Mars mission in India would typically start 24 months before launch, and in France we would consider it 5 years before launch, maybe 10. So this is a huge difference in the approach. I think on the other hand that we have a lot of similarities between French engineering and Indian engineering, especially in the way that we are very pragmatic and looking at things in a similar ways. I think we have a very good capacity of integrating our teams. So when we create integrated teams, they work usually very well.
And from what I know, even in France, the space agency took the lead in making sure the technology was developed and everything was mature. And then industry came up in taking up a lot of the innovation that was done publicly, and then looked at commercializing it in the markets. So how did actually this step up happen in France? Because today the likes of Airbus and Thales are really known across the world to build some of the best satellites.
Well, for sure, one of the difference between our organization and ISRO is that today ISRO does everything, while in our organization we do only the firsts, what we call, we will do something if it's the first time to prove the technology, and then everything recurrent is done by the industry. So we are more of looking after innovation and new developments, but then we pass over the whole thing to the industry. So today I see that a lot of movement is going on in India, and the idea of externalizing production of satellites and launch vehicles is going on. So it is a very interesting move to see how it will happen in Europe. We actually from the beginning started to work with industry very closely. So at CNES, no point of time have we built rockets or satellites from end to end by ourselves. So that's the difference.
So that's where I think India needs to kind of learn from France possibly on how some of the synergies can be transferred into the industry and kind of make the industry more mature.
Obviously, I think India can learn, but India needs also to be careful not to take too much of us, because we are very expensive, and if you copy us, you will become very expensive too, which is not the way we want to go. So I think between building Formula Ones and building Jeeps, there may be a medium term that still we need to find in the space community worldwide. And I would not be surprised if this medium term would be found by India itself, because India has all the capacities to work on some, standards and norms that can be the best for the future of space.
Okay, Mathieu, so jumping on to, let's say, the more recent developments and so on, I also believe that India is probably one of the only partners with France who built a joint satellite which was flown on the PSLV.
Yes, absolutely. So we have concentrated since more than 15 years on climate surveillance. So this was a very pioneering idea of the leaders of ISRO and CNES at the time, because no one was already talking of climate and the importance of space means to work on climate change. But ISRO and CNES took this further and developed very state-to-the-art satellites to measure. One, which is megatropic, is able to map moisture in 3D. So it's a satellite able to do a 3D mapping of moisture in the atmosphere on a continuous basis. So it's amazing because you can see videotape the movement of the clouds in the atmosphere. So this satellite has brought a lot of insight into what is happening to the climate and helps a lot to diagnose the reality of what is happening. So for climate research as such. But on the other hand, it brought a lot of operational capacity in India itself, because it allowed us to foresee the monsoon periods with 5 days. So this satellite has actually the capacity of predicting monsoon events, and today we are capable of giving a 5-day warning to farmers, which makes a tremendous difference, because they are able to harvest and to do what needs to be done before the big rains arrive. So all because of space assets. So the other satellite we launched together is Saral Altica, which is a bird equipped with an altimeter of extreme precision. So we can measure the water height with a precision of less than a millimeter. So it's an extremely useful tool, again, for climate change research, and again used for very pragmatic and operational activities. Because with this satellite, the Indian government is looking at water reserves, so the freshwater reserves available in the reservoirs all over the country, and also one can measure the water flow in the rivers. So depending on the season of the year, you can know exactly how many water is available, and it is a tremendous water management tool for India today.
As a follow-up to Saral and Megatropics, I believe there was also announcements of cooperation on a couple of other new 2 satellites. Can you share some more details on that?
Yes, absolutely. So we have 2 in the air and we have 2 still on the ground, and so one is a joint mission, which is OceanSat 3 with Argos. So this will fly beginning of 2020, and the French Argos system is well known now for positioning and collecting data of moving beacons. So for example, we can equip animals from turtles to elephants to little birds with receivers and emitters. So this is a nice and effective tool we have developed in cooperation with ISRO. ISRO has become a partner since several years now, and it's also that it has also a search and rescue function for especially for boats and fishermen and people on the sea.
Yeah, and also you were talking about, I think, Trishna, the new satellite as well.
So Trishna is in the line of what we have done earlier on climate surveillance, and it will complete the fleet. It's a satellite that will have a very high capacity in checking, monitoring thermal infrared. So it's a thermal infrared satellite with a mapping capacity to see the exchange of heat between the ground and the atmosphere. and also between the oceans and the atmosphere. So this element is a crucial part of the understanding of climate change, and the whole scientific community is very eager to get the results of this measurement. So this is something that will help the worldwide scientific community to solve the climate change problem.
The most recent announcement is, of course, the decision to work on a maritime constellation together that appeared very recently. And I would say India has a fairly long coastline of probably 7,000 or 8,000 kilometers, and maritime security remains one of the most important functions for a country like India. So what is the cooperation on this front?
Well, this was decided when the French President Emmanuel Macron visited India 1 year ago, and the project is very ambitious. It's probably the first time two nations decide to build a constellation, a space constellation of satellites together. The idea is to have a dozen of satellites that will look down at the maritime traffic and be able to distinguish the ships and their trajectories. And it's, well, there's some technical stuff behind that, but it's an extremely interesting project and very challenging for both the French and the Indian teams. So this project is something to be operational very fast. We have started a phase 1 of this project, which consists in the setup of Maritime Domain Awareness Center in India, which will start running on algorithms we will develop together, and it will start running on existing images. So that means that we have an intermediate phase in which we will work on existing images, commercially available images or images available from the ISRO and the European satellites. And in the meantime, we will develop our own constellation of satellites, and that will be the second phase of the program.
And when is the satellites expected to be in orbit?
Well, I think these are programs that take something like 5 years to do things in a proper way. So you can just start from now. I think in 5 years we should have them.
Okay. So we covered, I think, fairly a lot of aspects of cooperation on the satellite bit. Let's maybe come back to also the rockets themselves. So you talked about how possibly the same engine flies on the PSLV and the Ariane, and that was developed probably now already some 40 years ago. What are the new developments in the launcher related aspects?
Well, we have started a technical working group on launch vehicles in 2017, because for a long time we concentrated on satellites, and we felt the urgency of working again on launch vehicle technologies. Why? Because both Europe and France and India have similar challenges to meet and similar objectives for the future of their launch vehicles. And I think that we have identified a number of topics where we could put our competencies together and join our forces. And one of them is propulsion for new engines. So we are working on that. Our teams are working very closely together, and announcement will be done in the near future. And the other topic, which is of interest for both of us, is the reusability. So I think we both need to check what is the good strategy to have in terms of reusability, and we need to put all our efforts together to take our best women and our best men in our teams to find the most adapted and the most promising way we can do reusability in our way. We need to be innovative.
India has been flying to Moon and then also to Mars, and there have been follow-up missions now being planned. And of course, I think, I don't know if there were any French payloads on the earlier satellites. Is there any cooperation ongoing with respect to interplanetary exploration?
There is. We are discussing very much with ISRO on the future interplanetary missions of India. So one is a Venus mission, the other one is the Mars mission. I think that, and there will be probably a lot of others in the future, but those are the ones for the immediate future. So our scientific community in France is very eager to open up to new partners to be able to fly their instruments. Because, our first partner in cooperation is NASA, so we fly a lot of scientific instruments on NASA missions. Nevertheless, to be able to have a partner which is more adaptive and with whom you can fly maybe smaller instruments in an easier way is something we are very much looking after. So this is where ISRO is exactly the partner we need to fly scientific instruments. By the way, ISRO has become our second partner after NASA. So today, France's second partner in space is ISRO.
It's really wonderful to see that India is going on with several other countries into deep space. So the big announcement of this year is, of course, the human space flight. India did not want to initially do human space flight because Vikram Sarabhai famously said that India is a country that will not look to the things that the economically advanced nations would do in sending people to Moon or Mars and so on, but India will be second to none in applying the tools of space for solving the problems of the society. But then today the space program in India is kind of more mature in a sense, and is willing to take up this challenge of flying people to space. So obviously France has a lot of experience of human space flight. You've been doing it possibly for 50 years now, and so you have a lot of knowledge that could also be shared there.
Yeah, so first of all, I wish that India never abandons its priority for applications, because everyone in the world is looking at India, and especially we the French, as a model of a space power who has concentrated on space for its citizens. So that's my first thing. Second thing, yes, in France we have a huge experience with human space flight, because actually we had our French astronauts teams in the beginning of space history, so until 2000, year 2000. I actually was the one who negotiated the transfer of the French astronauts into the European ESA astronaut corps, and now in the European astronaut corps we have French astronauts, and CNES has a role given by ESA on the whole astronaut program. So we are doing, for example, the whole medical part for manned space for ESA is done in France. We have a medical hospital, a science hospital, a space hospital. So we have a space hospital in Toulouse, and France is responsible for the European Space Agency on the preparation of instruments to fly in the International Space Station, on the medical preparation of the astronauts, and also on part of the selection of the astronauts. So this is all this kind of things where we had a discussion with ISRO shortly after the announcement of Prime Minister Modi from the Red Fort that ISRO will, or India will, fly Indians into space. So I very rapidly had a call with my counterpart at ISRO, and we said we will work together on that, and we are ready to share everything we know in order to help India to manage this tremendous challenge. Actually, at the time we speak, there is a team of ISRO engineers and doctors, medical doctors in France, and they are training and looking at what we are doing for the European Space Agency and for the International Space Station. So this is the first steps of this cooperation we have together in manned space.
That's really excellent to know that this cooperation has already taken shape in some form, and look forward to seeing this day when India finally flies its first astronauts from its own soil. Coming back to the present day, today space is booming with a lot of startups, a lot of industry participation, venture capital money, private money being invested in space like never before. And this has become, I would say, a mostly US phenomena, where most of the startups are in the US. Possibly there are, give or take, 5,000 new startups around in the world in the last 1 decade or so, but then I'd say probably 70 to 80% of them may be in US, and also probably maybe $10 billion invested in space in the last 10 years or so, and also probably 70 to 80% of that money is also invested in the US. So there may be also common ground here for India and France to work together to encourage new startups, new companies. So what is it that you are doing in France that is encouraging this kind of a startup environment?
Well, first of all, I think that you're very nice with our American friends, because we have to consider that India and Bangalore is the second hub of NewSpace in the world, and I believe there is a lot of innovative companies that in space that are born here and that are developing here in Bangalore, and not necessarily all of them are in the US, and that's a very good thing. So in Europe we have also made a big effort in trying to help young companies and young entrepreneurs, especially at CNES. We started with creating a directorate for innovation, which is totally dedicated to work with young companies, and also to start, to create projects that are able to support this ecosystem. One of these projects is what we do in terms of nanosatellites development in France, and a new constellation of nanosatellites that we have announced, which name is CNES. So this is a whole different approach of space in partnership with young industry, and we have decided to bridge this approach with our Indian friends. So the idea is that French startups and Indian startups should be working together, and that both ecosystems should be able to benefit from what is given in the other country. So we are about to sign an agreement with an Indian partner on this, but the idea is, for example, that an Indian startup could be welcomed in a French organization and benefit from all the support that the French startups get, and the other way around. So this is, I think this is something that in future will, be the beginning of some bigger story, because if some startup grows up in France, some French startup grows up in India, this will create ties forever, and we will end up with probably French-Indian or Indo-French actors in the future, and we would be very happy to go that way. One significant thing, for example, is that a number of startups here in India, in the Indian NewSpace area, are opening offices in France. So this is a sign that they are healthy, first of all, and secondly that their entry door into Europe is going to be France and the partnership with CNES, which I think we positioned ourselves as a nice and helpful partner for these new players, and I wish that this goes on that way.
India's space program is, talked about being one of the most cost-effective space programs in the world. And, you've been here for a long time already, and you've been able to interact with the ecosystem, and you've seen several missions fly and so on. What is your experience and opinion about it?
Yeah, Narayan, I think that India has had tremendous success in making things at a lower cost, but it's easy actually. India makes things simple, and in making things simple you make them at a lower price as if you make them complicated. So the only question I would like to raise is at a moment of time your thoughts go on whether you need something complicated or whether something simple will be enough to realize your mission. And in a lot of cases, the answer is the simple thing may be enough. So there is only a small step in my mind to make the Indian method a world standard. And that would be to adapt it to the international markets and to the, there is a matter of acceptability of what you are doing. And there is it is extremely promising for India, in my mind, that the trend is to do things at a lower cost with quality and the reliability that is maintained, and that is exactly the equation we have here in India. So we are working with ISRO on all those thematics, and I think we always keep in mind that we need to be on those lines of reliability, quality, and low cost. And I think bringing together our expertise, and especially for us learning from India, is something that can lead us to maybe define the new standard of space production in the world in future.
All right, Matthew, on this note, I think thank you very much for your time for doing this, and I hope India and France together will continue to be very strong partners in space. We will see much more coming out of this relationship in the future.
I'm very much sure of it, Narayan. Thank you very much.
Thank you for staying until the end. If you have any comments or suggestions, please write to curator@newspaceindia.com. Please use the link in the description if you want to join the NewSpace India community, and have a great day or a lovely evening depending on wherever you're listening from.